I'm Gary Livengood, and I'm about to have a discussion with Dale Rolfzen here on Saturday, May 21st, 2016. We're currently located at the Community Media Center in Westminster, Maryland. Mr. Rolfzen, I appreciate your attendance and willingness to have a discussion relative to your armed forces experiences. And first of all, I'd like to thank you for your service, sir. We'll begin in the very early stages. Where were you born?
Well, I'm a prairie boy. I was born in Valley City, North Dakota.
And when was that, sir?
1943, February 7th, middle of a blizzard.
And your parents, their names and occupations?
They had a small farm. My father's name was Melvin, and my mother's name was Leona, and they got married and purchased a farm on credit and did very well. And my mother died when I was 5 years old after 4 kids, and it kind of changed our lives. It really put a strain on my dad, because with the 4 kids, the family got together, they were going to split everybody up amongst the family. Everybody was taking 1 or 2 to raise, and my dad wouldn't have any of that. So he tried his best, but it was rather a hectic life. We stayed in that, pretty much in that area, and then I went to high school in Valley City, and after my junior year, my dad had already moved down to the Twin Cities, and I was living with the stepmother along with my 2 brothers, and things got intolerable there, so we moved down to the cities. I finished my last year of high school and then pretty much wasted some time, tried a little college, ended up going to the Air Force in January 1968. And I always loved airplanes. You would think, well, being in the prairie, you didn't see them that often. So that's where my interest laid, and so like I said, I joined up with the Air Force and went to basic training in January, and got my first airplane ride, and an old DC-6, I think it was, four engine, prop job, sitting there with snow building up on the wing, fire coming out of one of the engines, but they took off anyway. And we kind of hopped and hopped and hopped down to Austin, Texas, and then transferred over to a turboprop for the last run into San Antonio. And went into basic training. It was a tough basic training because the first 3 weeks it rained constantly. We weren't able to get out on the drill pad and practice and everything, so we got mostly just classes and clean the barracks. At that time, they were actually bringing the barracks, a lot of the barracks, back out of mothballs, so to speak, that hadn't been used since the Second World War. I remember that because we could not get that barracks clean. We actually they played music, and we got everybody up on the 2nd floor, and we all jumped and danced around to try and shake all the dust loose so we could clean it up. So I went through the basic training and experienced then probably one of the things about the Air Force. They tended to do things like the way they wanted to do it. Now, I went in, I thought I was going to be an air traffic controller. Turned out I had an aptitude for languages, and they wanted to send me to language school. So I told them, I really don't want to do that. What else have you got? I want to be air traffic controller. And that was when I got my first lie. They said it wasn't in the career field that I enlisted in. So I said, well, what other options do I have? And I got down to weather observer and air police. Well, the air police, I had watched them training there at Lackland. That's where their school was, right there on the base. And that didn't impress me, so I said, well, weather observer doesn't sound too bad. What do you do there? And they said, well, usually you end up in Thule, Greenland, putting up weather balloons. I thought, well, they can't keep me there forever. So then the guy looked at me and he says, look, he says, if you take language school, I can guarantee you'll go to language school. If you don't, the only thing I can guarantee you is air police. So I said, well, it looks like I'm going to language school. So while I was finishing up basic training there, they had a group of people came in from the Institute of Far Eastern Languages at Yale University. And I don't know how they did it, but they seemed to get the first shot at the potential linguists. And they ran us through a little school thing and taught us as much Chinese as they could within 3 or 4 days. And out of that, they decided who they figured would do best at it. So after finishing basic training, I had a short leave and then went to Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. We were put up in a barracks or like a dorm building right on the university campus. And we attended classes in uniform, 8 hours a day, and then in 2 or 3 hours in study hall at night, just constantly learning and learning. And we learned a lot in 8 months. Turned out our class was one of the better ones that they had. I didn't know it at the time, but usually the average age of the classes going through there was 19 years. Ours was 22. And mind you, I was only 19 myself at that time. But it turned out that a lot of the guys who were there had come home and found draft notices in their mailbox. So first thing, the call went to the Air Force recruiter. And so we had a lot of college guys and so forth. So it did really well. We did well. We went through, even at the end, the thing with the Chinese characters. A lot of people don't realize Chinese is a very basic language. They don't have very many words, but they do have connotations that you use them in, so you know what you're talking about. And then there's 4 different ways of pronouncing each syllable, either a rising tone, a falling tone, a steady tone, or a low tone. And so you take the context and the word and how you say it, that gets it across what you're saying at the time. Characters, those you memorize. But there is a thing to that they had a dictionary, which a lot of people don't know, and the characters, the pictographs, are put together of what they call different radicals, which started way back from the days of when they used to draw a picture of the sun. They draw a picture of the sun behind a tree. That was the east. You'd have a long feathered bird, short feathered bird, stuff like that. But if you picked out the main radical in a character, count the brush strokes, and then you go into your dictionary, you look under that radical, you count the brush strokes, you go in, and then you find that picture of the character, and it would give you the thing. That was until you memorized them. So we went through that. While I was there, I had 2 very distinct things. The John F. Kennedy came to the university for their graduation, commencement. we had the honor of standing an honor guard for him. And I remember that was the year, and the thing where his main words that I remember was, he said, "Today I have the best of both worlds. I have a Harvard education and a Yale diploma." And then also, I don't know if it was before then or after, but the Cuban Missile Crisis came up. And all of us there hadn't been in uniform very long. And I mean, everything was going like, whoa, are we going to war or what? And so finally, somebody came down and said, look, just keep going to classes. We don't need you yet. So, but it was rather unsettling. So we got out of that and finished up the 8 months, graduated, and then we were assigned to Goodfellow Air Force Base down in San Angelo, Texas. We went down there, and our first thing there is they took us into a room, and they played a tape, and they said, now you're going to forget all about the Chinese you learned. This is what you're going to be listening to. And it was aircraft traffic, and it was like a whole nother language. Had not a clues to what he was saying. So between that, of going through that training every day, listening to the different aircraft, which you could tell pretty well by the expertise of the pilots, if they were really loose wheels, you know, and you could hardly understand them. That would be a MiG-15 or a 17, maybe even a 19. The better pilots flew the 19s. But they wore these throat mics. And they were activated by a voice. So they didn't really know how to use them that well, and which meant they always cut off the first word before you would get the traffic coming through. We learned a lot there, and also while we're going through this, we had a very extensive security training. I mean, they just pushed that. You do not talk to anybody about what you're doing, other than, you know, where you'd been and schooling, some of the schooling that you had. We went through that, and then I was lucky enough to be kept behind with a few other people, and they trained us for the airborne side of it. Normally, our people would go to Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, and they would work in ground bases just listening to radio traffic that came to them because of their proximity. Obviously, that wasn't enough. It's a big country. It was hard to get as much traffic as you could, so they came up with this system of, they took C-130s and they put a thing inside of it like a big trailer compartment or something, and that had positions in it with all the radios and direction finders and recorders and stuff like that. And that was our job, to ride in those. And we would go, a typical mission for us out of Japan would be to get up at some ungodly hour, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, go down to briefing and everything, be in the air by at least 5 o'clock in the morning, and then we would fly out, cross over Korea, and start picking up air traffic. And after we got over Korea, we would turn and go on down the coast. And depending on who they were interested in, you know, which airfield and so forth, we would get to a certain area, and then we would fly orbits, just kind of back and forth outside of the limits of what they considered their airspace. And we flew at 28,000 feet, as I said, in the C-130. We had, it's kind of hard to talk about this because we weren't allowed to. After we had gotten out of San Angelo, we went through a survival school at the old State Air Force Base outside of Reno, while it was still an Air Force base. And there they put us through a simulated POW camp with all of the inducements to get you to talk, sleep deprival. They would put you, normally you could tell when you were going to be interrogated because they would stick you in a black box for a couple of hours and you lost all circulation in your legs and everything. They would do that. I guess they figured it would soften you up. So it taught us even more to keep our mouths shut and certain things. Under interrogation, they would use any means they could to get at you. At that time, it taught me don't have your picture taken, don't have any tattoos, don't have any external correspondence with people outside of your family and your friends, stuff like that. So,
and the purpose of that was?
If we were ever shot down and captured, they would interrogate us. Everybody knows from Korea how they tried to get people to sign the false confessions and stuff like that. And getting shot down was a definite possibility because we did lose a plane flying with mostly Russian linguists over Turkey. It was a C-130 like ours. They had been flying a mission in northern Turkey just off of the Russian border. And what they were doing at that time is they had set up a system of radio towers, and it gave them like a triangular thing that they could fly on to make sure that they weren't going over the Russian border. We were always very careful about not doing that. While the Russians found a way of bending the radio signals. And they lured a C-130 in and shot it down. And I think we only got 5 remains back out of 2 pilots, 2 navigators, a crew chief, 2 radio repairmen, 10 operators at position, and usually carried 2 spares on the plane. That's how many went down, and as I said, only 5 came back. So there was no guarantee you were going to come back.
What hostilities were going on at that time?
There were really not hostilities, but you're talking only around 10 years after the Korean War. And so things were still pretty set. My position, I had a VHF receiver, which we would pick up their fighters on and their ground control operators. I also had an HF receiver. Now, on the HF, you would get their bombers and their civil nav, and also their air defense communications from the radar units. The person who sat next to me was, we call him a diddy-bop. He was a Morse code operator, and he would listen on HF to their traffic. They had a means where they would take a radar plot, and they had a grid map of the China and the whole outside area and everything. And these main grids were delineated by a 01, 02, 03 going across, and then you would have the same going up and down. So the first 4 numbers gave you the grid. And then they would take that grid, divide it into 9 parts, and then the next part of that would be one of those, 9, and then they would divide that again. So it's pretty much pinpointed it. And the reason we carried the BAT 9, we call them, they call us bats because the air crews were not allowed, the ones who flew the planes were not allowed in our things while we were working. Some of them had secret clearances. They could actually look at the equipment, but they couldn't be in there when we were taking this. So the purpose of the BAT 9 was to listened to their radar plots because we could pick up when they were tracking us, and it was a good way of knowing where you were, where they figured you were. Because obviously, if you got in too close, they were going to come out for you.
And you are basically gathering intel on both China and Russia at that time?
Not Russia. The Russian effort was handled somewhat on the ground base we had in Korea, and the Far East Russian traffic was handled by units that were flying the new KC-135s, but they weren't tankers. They were intercept things. They were flying out of Alaska. They would go out of Alaska and go down along the coast and maybe overnight in Korea or Misawa, northern Japan, and then go back up. So,
how many years did you do this?
well, I think they first started the reconnaissance thing after the Korean War. The first planes they had fixed up were the old RB-50s, which was kind of a reconditioned B-29. And then they had gotten into the C-130s because they could stay up longer and cheaper fuel and stuff like that. But I say in the mid-50s. I think the first C-130 that went out came out in 58. So, and of course I was only there for the 2 years. But we were listening to North Korea, we were listening to Russia, and then of course we had the units over in the Middle East, which were taking Russian, they were taking Serbian, and just about any of the satellite countries that Russia had for years. They were doing that. And nowadays you don't see it anymore because, and I found out later too, you put a satellite up over the countries, or a couple of them, you got 24/7. They know everything that's going out. I mean, because they got a better viewpoint, and then these satellites could be linked together, and it was all brought to Fort Meade down there at NSA. So the linguists end up going there now rather than traveling overseas and through the Orient and everything like we did. Going to those radar trackings, okay? Once in a while on my HF, if things were slow, I could pick up the same traffic going out in voice. And I used to, then I would borrow a map from the Diddy Bop sitting next to me, and I would track on that. I would track other stuff that they were doing, and us especially. It gave me practice on picking up the numbers because, man, they bang, 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 they were rapping it out. So I was doing that one day. We were flying up and down the coast of China, and we went up. We were getting ready to head back to Japan. So as we came up, we took a turn, and then we would come across Korea, pick some traffic up as we're doing that. So the plane turned, and I felt it, and everybody else did too. But the numbers I'm getting is tracking us right up into that body of water between North Korea and China, which is don't go here land. So I go along and I'm expecting, I don't know what this guy is doing. The Diddy Bop, his tracking picked us up and turned us over. So I called my crew chief up real quick and I said, hey, I'm getting this by voice that we're going up the chute here, and the Diddy Bop says we turn. Whether we were out there or not, it depended on how much credence they put in their tracking. They might send somebody out. So the crew chief called up to the flight deck and to the pilot, and he said, sir, would you verify our position? And that got their attention. So, as I said, at that time, the C-130 had 2 navigators, and boy, they got at it. And yeah, we're okay. But then after a while, this voice that I was listening to, it stopped. And then when the numbers started coming again, he had us out there where we really were supposed to be, over Korea. So that was a hair-raising thing. Vietnam.
Well, and that is about the era that Vietnam is starting. I'm assuming you were also involved in gathering intel relative to what was going on in Vietnam.
Yes, we started going down to Vietnam during 1964. And what we would do is we would fly down, and they actually put us up in Bangkok. We stayed in Bangkok. And we always had 2 planes down there. We would fly, one would be flying every day. So you had a day off and a day on, and you would gather the intel. We would take off from Bangkok, fly across Laos, South Vietnam, go up into the Gulf of Tonkin, and then we flew like a big figure-8 orbit between Hainan Island and North Vietnam. And we would pick up Chinese traffic from Hainan Island, South China, and then after a while we ended up with some Vietnamese linguists riding along with us. And from time to time a Russian, because we were picking up Russians flying the North Vietnamese MiGs. This is where I couldn't say anything. The Chinese knew what we were doing, but they didn't know how good we were. And we knew their Air Force better than they did. We knew where their planes were, who their ground controllers were, where the air bases were, what their proficiency was. Anytime they moved, we were on top of it constantly. That was our job. And we would fly our missions there. We would land at Da Nang, pull off on a taxiway. A Jeep would come up, open the back door. They never even shut the engines down. We would give them our bag tape recordings, and they had people set up there at Da Nang to process them. And then in the meantime, we would take off and go back over to Bangkok.
Well, I realize that we're running short of time here, but I do have one other final question. Your experiences in the military, in the armed forces, how's it impacted your life? Because you've been away from the military for a number of years now. What kind of impact has that experience had?
Well, actually, it impacted. I got out of the service. I went to Florida for a while. I climbed telephone poles in Tennessee. I went up, became a carpenter in Alaska, and ended up finally working a job down here in Maryland. Met my wife, everything, and while I'm working for a contractor, we ended up doing a couple of contracts out at the Air Guard base at Martin's. And I ended up getting recruited in there, and I spent 20 years in the Air National Guard. And which brings me to my other little note on here. I kind of had a brush with Desert Storm. The Air National Guard engineers put together a project to design and build a temporary expansion of the mortuary facilities at Dover. And this was undertaken because Desert Storm, the generals who were running that were in Vietnam. And the casualties that came back from Vietnam were stored in refrigerated trailers at Dover and in California. Dover had a small operation, and they never expanded it. There were remains that never got sent back for like 6 months after they came back from Vietnam. And it was one of those never again. So I went over there, kind of a volunteer thing, on active duty for a week while they were building these expansions. And by that time, they were starting to get casualties in already from Desert Storm, or the prelude to it. And
Well, obviously, it's had a significant impact upon your life. Okay. Well, I certainly do appreciate your story, sir. And again, I would like to thank you for your service.
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.